Okay. All right. Okay, so, and then I'm just going to say this right now. I get a little nervous when I know I'm being recorded, so I'm going to stumble through some words here for a few minutes. Maybe I won't now that I've said that. Um, what I do want is I'll pull up my PowerPoint now because that'll keep me on track because I know we are limited to 1 hour here and I've already used up 7 minutes. So let me get this PowerPoint shared. Let's see, how do I do this? I go to share. Okay. So I'm imagining you all can see my PowerPoint, not in a slideshow right now. Okay, so I'm going to start my slideshow. Can you see the slideshow? Okay, awesome. I stumbled through that a few times in some presentations. So, okay. So I really just want to talk about how I came to this work because when I talk about cultural humility, I use my own narrative a lot. And so I am originally from from Pryor, Montana, which is located on the Crow Indian Reservation in southeastern Montana. I grew up around my family, my Abzalga family on my father's side. And so really grew up immersed in the Crow culture. My mother is Blackfeet. And so if you know anything about Montana history, the Crow and Blackfeet have, they've been territorial enemies for time immemorial. And so I always make the joke of I'm my own worst enemy, but sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't. So we're on Zoom. I can't tell if it landed or not. But I am very proud to be part of both of those tribal nations as they both have very rich cultures. But my perspective is mainly from an Abzalga perspective because I have grown up amongst my Abzalga family. I currently serve as the Director of Inclusive Excellence for Student Success. That sounds really, really fancy because the title, but what I really do day in and day out is provide student support to our Black, Indigenous, and students of color on our campus. I do lots of trainings around diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism and what that means to institutions of higher ed, and in this case, institutions of healthcare. And so I'm really excited to bring that knowledge here with you all today. I also bring myself as an educator and as an advocate to this training. And I like to name those two things up front because that's really when I'm doing when I'm leading these types of information sessions, those are the way that is the lens I am leading through advocacy, allowing people to have access to institutions and services, and really hoping to help people be open to thinking about other ways of knowing and walking through this world. And so like I said, I grew up on the Crow Reservation, so a rural community. I know AHEC, that is one of the focuses, is providing services to rural communities. I also teach a course out of Native American Studies called The Intersectionality of American Indians, Rurality, and Disability. And so really focus on what healthcare access and what that means in rural settings, specifically Montana in the class that I teach. And so that topic is very near to my heart as well. I grew up on the Crow Indian Reservation in a small community, but I went to high school off the reservation at a Catholic school, and then attended, of course, predominantly white institutions throughout my higher education. And so have had experiences both being immersed in my culture and then going through an education system that was outside of my Abzalga culture. But those experiences I always feel grateful for because being grounded in who I am as a Crow person has really helped me navigate the institutions that weren't built for me. And so that allows me to talk about them in a different way. And that allows me hopefully to talk about them in a way that is inclusive and provides an understanding for people who haven't come from that background. And so that is my hope that's my goal for all of you today, is that I really bring a perspective that isn't always fully accessible, or you don't always get access to. So I do have some time in there for questions, but definitely that's the way I teach, is I want to meet my audience where they're at. And so as you have questions, I can't see the chat right now, but I'm assuming if a chat question pops up, I'll be able to see it. So if not, if Irene or Greta will help me, tell me if there's a question in there, I'd appreciate that. Okay, so the first thing I like to start off with is terminology. I began this role, actually most of my career was spent in student services and supporting students in higher education with an emphasis on American Indian students. And it wasn't until my graduate work that I really expanded providing support to a diverse groups of students. And it actually wasn't until this job that I now serve in that I really started thinking about what are the needs of all underrepresented communities. And so I have been doing lots of trainings around what does that mean? What does BIPOC mean? What does DEI mean? All of these things. And one of the common message that is given during trainings talking about cultural issues is that the terminology is really important. It's important that we come to the table with we all have the same understanding of the terminology we're using, because it's already hard enough to talk about differences, especially cultural differences. And so in order to have productive conversations and understandings, it's important that we're understanding the terminology that we're using. And so just a highlight of some of the terms that I'll be covering today. We're going to start out with DEI. I think, I don't know about in your world, but in my world, the acronym DEI gets thrown around like everybody knows what we're talking about, because of the social injustices between the pandemic and then between our policing system that have been that have been highlighted or unveiled over the past couple of years. DEI has really become a goal for institutions to implement. And in order to understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion are important, it's important to understand what each of those words means. I added racial justice in there because that's another component that you'll also see. So you'll see different versions of DEI. You'll see DEI, you'll see EDI, you'll see JEDI, you'll see DEIJ. It comes in all different forms, but know that when you see that acronym in whatever form it is, we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice. So diversity is our differences, right? What just bringing in this setting right now, we have who knows how many differences we're representing. And that's not only race, but that's gender, that's country of origin, that's, all kinds of things. So diversity is one of those terms that we've had pretty commonly in all of our systems. Equity is the fair treatment, access, and opportunity and advancement. So equity is the piece that I really try to focus on in the work that I'm doing, because it requires us to evaluate systems and institutions so we're able to remove those barriers that prevent full participation of individuals or groups. And so although diversity has been, it's kind of one of those terms where sometimes we glaze over it because we've heard it so much, I really want you to start thinking about that equity component of DE&I, and really start thinking about how do I begin to evaluate these systems, especially the healthcare systems. And we have lots of examples now that we have experienced this pandemic to really think about what does equity mean to my profession, to be as a nurse in Montana or as a physical therapist in Idaho. Like, what does equity mean when it comes to my job? So really taking the time to evaluate those systems. Inclusion is differences are welcome, perspectives are heard, and belonging is felt by all. All can fully participate. I think because diversity has been put into practice, or the goal of diversifying structures has been put into practice, we assume that inclusion just comes along with that, and that's not always the case. It's one thing to have, I'm going to say 3 BIPOC public health nurses on your staff. It's another to when you're having your staffing or you're having, so your staffing, that their voices and their experiences are, one, invited to that setting, and second of all, heard in that setting. It's really common, actually before the role I'm in now, it was really common for me to be invited to planning meetings and meetings where we were focusing on increasing American Indian enrollment numbers. Being invited to it, it was a whole nother thing for me to be invited to speak or welcomed or feel like I was welcome to speak. And after speaking, actually being heard, right? So when we talk about inclusion, those are the two components that we need to also make sure that we're focusing on, is inviting that person, making sure that person feels like they are invited into the conversation and heard, and their voice is valued. The last term on this slide is racial justice. Racial justice and anti-racism are very closely related. And so racial justice is systemic and proactive reinforcement of public policies, institutional practices, cultural messages, and social norms needed to achieve and sustain racial equity. So that's really the proactive, the active piece of all of this, DE&I, and the reinforcement of it. Before I jump to anti-racism, any questions that are popping up, Greta or Irene? Okay. Sorry, this terminology part, I feel like I talk a lot and I talk pretty fast. So anti-racism, which is another newer term. Before I start talking about anti-racism, I do want to say, as DEI, as the field of DEI evolves, the terminology is evolving very quickly as well. And so anti-racism was a term that I learned probably like my first week on the job. I started in February of 21. So kind of the tail end of our isolation period. And anti-racism was being used very commonly. And as a Native person, I've always shied away from the term racism or racist, or, I've tried not to use that because my generation, the people in my generation we were not ever taught to openly talk about race. It was one of those things where you just don't commonly talk about it. Because of that, we have inherited lots of issues around race, right? And so the term anti-racism, I really shied away from for probably the first quarter of my career in this position, in this role as Inclusive Excellence Director. And finally, one day, one of my colleagues who was, she's actually quite a bit younger than me, she was using the term so easily. It was just rolling off her tongue. And I was like, Jordan, I have to stop you. What does I mean, I could have Googled it, right? I was even afraid to Google it. That's just being transparent here. And I said, Jordan, what does anti-racism mean? And she's like, Selena, it's the action piece. And she was so passionate about it. And she broke it down for me. And I was like, oh yeah, I need to be using that term in the work that I do. And so I share that story because it goes along with the component that race and culture and differences aren't always easy to talk about, but we don't ever go anywhere if we don't start talking about them. And so I guess that's just my little motivational piece, that yes, ask those questions. They're important, especially when you're afraid of not knowing. Like, that's what keeps us halted in our cultural humility development. So with that being said, anti-racism, the active process of identifying, challenging, and confronting racism. This active process requires confronting systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, behaviors, and attitudes. This active process should seek to redistribute power in an effort to foster equitable incomes. As I was putting this presentation together for you all, I realized the terminology of cultural humility and anti-racism probably don't always go hand in hand, because anti-racism it feels like more of the language you would use around protesting, but I really don't see the term anti-racism in that way. I really see it the way I interpret anti-racism is, what am I doing as an individual to disrupt these to either disrupt racism or disrupt inequities. And so in your case, what are the things you will be doing to disrupt access, equitable access to healthcare? And so really thinking that, those two things they go hand in hand. And so wanted to introduce that, I wanted to include that term in this presentation. One of the other very common terms that we'll hear anytime we're talking about health, equity around health issues is intersectionality. And I'm going to, I don't know if I should play this video or not. Can you hear it? Okay.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African-American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
All right. Kimberly Crenshaw was the developer that came up, introduced the thought of intersectionality, and I use it in all the work that I am doing around inequities and social justice. And so also a very important concept to be thinking about when we're talking about cultural humility and when we're talking about creating equal access or equitable access to healthcare. All right, so I think this is the final term that I'm defining in this setting, and that's cultural humility. This is the process of committing to an ongoing relationship with patients, communities, colleagues, and requires humility as individuals continually engage in self-reflection and self-critique. This is a lifelong process. This is a process that I'm sure each of you in your level of education have already addressed at some level. And so today I'm just hoping that I can continue to give you some tools and skills to help further your cultural humility. And for those of us who just haven't had the opportunity to really be exposed to that, I'm hoping I'm being able to plant those seeds to help you develop your cultural humility within your profession. Cultural humility, practicing cultural humility allows one to take into account the fluidity and subjectivity of culture. This allows us to change ourselves and institutions to address inequalities. I think when I was creating this PowerPoint, I added this piece because for me, this was where cultural humility and anti-racism met. It was, it's really requiring us to do some self-reflection on how we think about culture, where some of our stereotypes come from, and then act on that, act to change some of that misinformation. I'm gonna peek at my notes here to make sure that I wasn't totally off with that. Oh yeah. Okay, so the other thing so I come from a field that uses the term cultural competency, and I never questioned that, right? It was, I come from the counselor education field, and so mental health counseling uses cultural competency a lot. And so I did just want to put this slide up just to show the differences of cultural competency and cultural humility. Although, of course, I favor cultural humility, because even just the phrasing of that leads you to the thought process that it's me humbling myself, requiring me to learn about people's differences, other people's cultures, other people's perspectives, other people's experiences, where cultural competency kind of sends the message that, oh, once I learn about X, Y, and Z, I am then competent in this field, or in this in this perspective of my profession. And as we all know, there are the diversity within not only the institutions that we work for, but the patients that we provide care for. Everybody comes from a different experience, whether they're from the same family or not. They're coming from a different experience, and it's really important that we humble ourselves to be open to learning about that experience when those opportunities are given to us. And so just wanted to acknowledge that I guess that those are two terms that are used within the healthcare professions. So I have done a lot of talking. Now that we've gotten through the terms, and it looks like I'm talking fast enough that we do have time for some questions, are there any questions? And of course, I know we all interact in a different way in Zoom, so either unmute yourself or throw some questions in a question in the chat. If you need clarification on something I said, or is there a term that maybe you wished I would have included in some of this? Yeah, just open to that. And I'm scared to push too many buttons. So if something comes up in the chat, let me know. Okay, I'm a counselor, so sometimes I can give too much silence, but I'll try not to do that because I know we only have 30 minutes left.
Dr. Hill, there is a question. I have a question regarding using the term American Indian rather than Indigenous, and which is appropriate given the history of the term. That's coming from a student.
I really appreciate that question. Of course, the most common answer you'll get to that question is to use the term of the tribal affiliation. So if you're working with a Blackfeet person, to use that term, Blackfeet tribe or Blackfeet nation. When you're talking about American Indian people overall, it's really about where you're coming from. The tone that you use is the genuine, the way you would genuinely talk about American Indian people. You'll see in the literature, American Indian, anything previous to 2020 is usually American Indian. There are very few Native American references in the literature, but Indigenous now from 2020 on, Indigenous is really being used more widely. But using the tribal affiliation of the group of people you're talking about is always most appropriate, but that doesn't always apply. But using it the way you would naturally talk about that the American Indian group of people is another common way to do it. I think if you're too hesitant, that just brings up red flags that you're not comfortable talking about Native American people, right? But if you would, if you're comfortable talking about health issues that address like diabetes among the American Indian community, like how you would just normally talk to a group of people, if it rolls off and doesn't, cause any uncomfortableness in yourself, then I think that's probably what is important. Now, that is my perspective as one American Indian person. And you can see even in the way I talk about it, I use American Indian, I use Indigenous, I do that on purpose. I try to mix it up to show you that they're all, that they're all there. It's okay to use all the terms. It's just in how you're presenting that, I guess. So I hope that was helpful. Any other questions around that? Or anything else around terminology?
There's one more question, which I don't know, you might address it later on, but how would you recommend confronting an individual who has expressed racial prejudice?
I don't have that in this training. I just need a little bit of clarification there. Are you trying to correct misinformation, or is the person using racial slurs and you're trying to correct that behavior?
Misinformation. And
Misinformation.
Michaela, feel free to come off mic if you're more comfortable with that.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that you're just trying to correct misinformation. The one thing that I always tell, so we have an allyship training that that Dr. Ali Pepper out of the Student Assault Resource Center and I do. And the one thing we always talk about is safety, like really assessing your safety, both mental and physical safety. So when you're trying to correct misinformation, like let that be your number one thing, right? And second of all, the reason this person is using, I'm just gonna use the example of a racial slur. The reason they're using this example of a racial slur or using the racial slur is because it might be that's all they know, or two, it's because they have misinformation about that group. And so I would recommend that you say, that's really interesting that you use that term because it's actually really offensive. And this is the proper term to use for this group of people. And so really trying to just replace that information is probably the most important. Sometimes a person will use a racial slur because they've had an experience with somebody of that group of people and they're still carrying that experience with them. And so if they are willing to engage in that conversation, you can say, wow, like that's racist. And why are why do you have that? Why are you talking about them in this way? Because then they're going to tell you what happened, right? They're going to give you a little bit of a story. Well, back in the 1957, and you can say, oh yeah, I can understand why you would, use that term, but it's actually really inappropriate and it's hurtful. There's no book. There's no one way to address this, but what you're wanting to do is provide correct information, and you're wanting to do it in a non-confrontational way, because one, they want that reaction, right? They want you to be like, that's racist, and get in this, argument so they can prove further that they're right. You don't want to go there with them. You want to hear like, what? Why are you using this term? And then you want to provide correct information and correct terminology in a calm way. And so when I say check your mental health, I mean, like mentally, are you safe? There are some terms where if they're used around me, I'm going to react in a way that you don't want to see me react. And so in those situations, depending on who the other person is, sometimes I won't react. I'll just ignore because I'm like, I don't have time for this. So it depends. It's situational. It depends on who the other person is, all of the things. So really good question though. Anything else in the chat? Okay. All right, I'm going to go on to the next one. This is a video I use in my not inclusive excellence, too many I words, intersectionality course. And it's a doctor who provides service to an American Indian community. And I appreciate it because he talks about cultural humility without naming cultural humility. So I'm going to play this video for you now.
All physicians nowadays are seeking a place of refuge. All physicians, good physicians, want to do just one thing. We want to do our doctor thing. That's all we want to do. We want to take care of patients. We want to take care of them the way we were trained to take care of them. And that takes time. Good history, good physical exam, getting to know the patients, really digging into their history, and being able to take the time to understand that with human beings, everything is connected to everything else. People don't just come in for knee pain. They come in for knee pain, which may cause problems sleeping. Over time can cause problems with depression. You have to address those. Here, I see a patient with a problem. I can say, hey, I know you don't just have knee pain. How are things going in your job? Is it affecting your job? Is it affecting your sleep? How are things going? And I may have to say, look, I know these things are going on and are probably an issue, and we may not be able to address them today, but I'm going to make a note of it in my chart here. Let's cover it again. Come back 2 weeks. Let's keep going. Let's go on with this. Let's get you moving. Let's get you going. Let's make you comfortable and get on with your life. When I joined this organization, I said to myself, I'm gonna try to be a part of this culture the best I can as a white man. And so I decided to focus specifically on Shawnee because this is where we are. And so I said, I'm gonna learn some of the language. And when an elder comes in, I can greet them in their language. And I can, in a way, I can artificially connect myself with them. You know what I'm saying? And it's really great. I love it, you know? Because when an elder comes in, for instance, and I can offer them a greeting, wishy-wapani, which is good morning, you know, it comes with a lot of surprise. Like, here's this white guy who's taking the time to learn, I'm never going to be proficient, but at least some of the language. It helps me connect with them. It does help me in my patient care, especially with the Shawnee people. Take care of patients. That's probably my #1 passion.
All right. So I'm going to talk about cultural humility a little bit and how we develop that, how we practice that. And then we're going to put you into some groups so you have some a chance to visit with your peers and talk about some of these topics as well. So how do we practice cultural humility? One of I'm going to start with this. We start with ourselves. We start with really doing some self-reflection on how do I walk through this world? And so one of the ways to think about that are, what are my lenses? How do I, what experiences have I had? Where do I come from? What is my background? And how has that shaped the way I see and experience the world? Because if we don't do that, if we don't start with our own reflection and our own experience, it's harder for us to empathize or to connect with another person's experience if we haven't even thought about, how did I get to this place? How do I see myself as an Indigenous woman? How do I see myself as an Indigenous health professional? You know, like really having that self-reflection is really important. I take this step for granted because I come from the field of counselor education, and if any of you come from a mental health background, you know how much reflection, self-reflection goes into be training to be an ethical and quality mental health provider. And so sometimes I skip over this really quickly because I've done it so much in my career, but it is really where this work starts. It's you thinking about your experiences and the group that you identify with, and what does that mean? How does that shape the experiences that I have? So that's step one. The next step is becoming aware. When I say self-awareness, so I'm just going to use a story. Sorry, I teach with story a lot, so I shouldn't apologize for that. I teach with story a lot. So when I first started the work around multicultural counseling and developing cultural competency, cultural humility, one of the first things that I had to do was really actually admit that as a Native American woman, that I had stereotypes and I had racism, I had racist thoughts, I had racist ideas. because as a member of an underrepresented group, I thought because I was a member, I didn't have any stereotypes. I didn't have any misunderstandings about other groups. Everybody had it about my group, but I didn't have it about anybody else's group. And so that process for me, I was in my mid-20s when I had to go through that, was really hard because I was like, what? What? I have stereotypes about other groups of people. I have misunderstandings about other groups of people. And not only to acknowledge that, but then to really acknowledge what they were. And they come up when you're reading an article about a group of people. They come up when you are out at the grocery store and you encounter somebody that you wouldn't see in an everyday setting. And that initial thought, that initial recording that plays in your head about that group of people, like that's where that's where you need to start, is acknowledging those stereotypes. And then when you are able to acknowledge them and admit that you have them, not that you have to like wear a t-shirt that says, I also have stereotypes, but just having that conscious effort of, oh, wow, that is one of my stereotypes, is, one of the first steps. And then you have to do the next step, and that's educate. You have to seek, you have to educate yourself. You have to seek educational opportunities to correct that misinformation you have. The education piece can look so different. It can look so many different ways. It's not always going to be, oh, you go to a cultural humility workshop, or, oh, I take a Native American studies class. No, I mean, there's so many ways to educate yourself about other groups of people. My newest thing is podcasts. I love podcasts because I'm pretty sure I have ADHD. And so to be able to hear something and work on a task at the same time helps me focus. And so I intentionally listen to podcasts that are
go conversation.
Oh, I thought I heard somebody talking. I intentionally look for podcasts. I thought it was going to be a recommendation of a podcast, sorry, from groups of people or from individuals that don't come from places that I come from. One of my students last year, he's from one of the inner city. And so he's like, Selena, you got to check out my podcast. And I was like, oh yeah, of course, and I do whatever I can to support students. I learned so much about growing up in an urban setting in California that I would have never ever thought of, and I was doing two things. One, I was supporting a student, but two, I was educating myself about his experience. And so that's just one example of a way to do that, but really seeking and being intentional and seeking ways to really learn about other cultures and other experiences. And this is a lifelong process. This is not something that, you learn about 3 other cultures and check, I got my education piece there. This is you moving from, sorry, I saw one person from Idaho on her. You moving from Idaho to Washington and working within a Muslim community, and you learning about that Muslim community, and then being transferred to Montana and working on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, and then you learn, like seeking opportunities to learn more about the Northern Cheyenne people. So it's like not that you only have to learn about the people you're working with, but that's where that starts. Because once you realize the richness of culture, well, for me, once I realized the richness of other cultures and how I could connect with other cultures, like it just made me want to learn more. So just know that that's a lifelong process. And sometimes we don't even know we're going to learn something new, and we do. The other component of that is relationship building. And so as you're working amongst people who come from different backgrounds than you, relationship building is a very important piece to healthcare. And so in that, there's a piece within the relationship building, there's a piece where that person that sorry, I don't want to use client because that's what we use in mental health, but that patient who you're developing that relationship, in that when they're sharing a piece of their, whether it's maybe culture or recipe or family story, when they're sharing that piece with you, that's a gift. Like it's showing you that they trust you enough with this personal information. And I always tell people, like, don't ever take those moments for granted, because when those moments come, that means they want you to know about them and who they are and where they come from. But in that story, in that sharing of personal information, it's also you telling you a lot about the community. That's not a time for you to like start asking a whole bunch of questions about, oh, so I always wondered about this, or I always wondered about that. That's a time for you to take mental note of what you don't know that they're talking, what maybe some terms that they use that you're just not sure about, like, oh, I don't know what that word means, or what does that, what's entailed in that ceremony. Like, then you get to go back and do some research on your own, right? And the research will, doing that research will also look many different ways. It might be talking with a colleague who's been in the community for a while. It might be watching a documentary on I don't know, on sun dances, or, sorry, I'm pulling things from my own culture, but it's that form then comes in different ways. So, however, there are some opportunities that you work with people and they want you to ask questions, but when they want you to ask questions, they'll let you know too. They'll be like, you know what, thank you for asking me that. Nobody ever asked me about that. Or they'll say, yeah, anytime you have a question about something, just call me. They'll invite you to do that. So I think sometimes that can get blurry, and just be really aware when you're in those situations. Like, are they just sharing this piece of themselves with me because they just want me to know this piece, or are they inviting me to ask more things? So that's a very important practice in the education piece. And then practicing it, applying this knowledge into your work. As an educator, I was once taught, like, you don't really understand something until you try to teach somebody else. And so sometimes that's like going home and talking about, oh, guess what I learned today about so-and-so, or that's going to your colleagues and saying, you know what, during this appointment with our patient, I learned this, and it I don't know, it's teaching other people, and it's putting into practice that when you meet another person from that culture or that background, you kind of are able to tailor some of those questions to fit some of the information that you learned from another person. So applying your knowledge is another important piece to cultural humility. And with that being said, I'm going to put you into, I think we only have till 5, right? I'm going to put you, we'll do 5 minutes. I don't know how big the groups are, but I want you to think of what your 3 most influential or significant lenses are. So remember, lenses are our frame of reference, our perspectives. So for me, my example would be, my 3 lenses are being a Crow person, a Crow woman specifically, a mother, and an educator. So those are the 3 lenses that I look at the world in. So in your groups, please share 3 of your significant lenses with your partners.
Okay, Irene, are you ready for me to put them in the rooms?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes.
Okay, no, you're good. I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Okay.
Just make sure you hit accept room, invite.
I got too overconfident with time.
No, you're good.
That was great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot. Thank you,
Mhm.
Dr. Hill. We're always a little chaotic in these. They're each time, like last time, only like 5 people showed up, so it's never super predictable.
And I think once they're in groups, we'll give them, are they groups probably about 5 people, or?
Yeah, they're anywhere from, it looks like 3 to 5.
Okay, let's give them at least
People.
5 minutes then. That would,
Okay, so bring them back at maybe 5 till.
yeah. And I'm gonna see where I can. So that last discussion, we won't break them up. We'll just ask
Okay.
them to maybe put something in the chat.
Okay.
Perfect.
No, it's like when all these married couples live around Chester, all their
I'm gonna check the chat here because I finally found the key. When I open it, you can't see it on the screen share, can you? Okay,
I don't think so.
all right. Yep, it's open. Okay. I'm always worried to start clicking on stuff when I'm presenting because I've gotten myself in a few pickles doing that.
I'm the same way. Even when I'm not presenting, I'm like, don't touch it.
Now, what does DNP stand for on April's name here? April Charlotte says Montana and then DNP.
Oh, she is in the, I guess it's the Doctor of Nursing Practice program.
Okay, okay.
So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, that is cool. I was trying to use different examples and I didn't know what half the acronyms
I
were.
know, I don't either, honestly.
I was like, oh, shoot.
Let's see. Oh no, it looks like there's someone in a room by themselves.
Oh.
Okay.
I think, Greta, if you close the breakout rooms, they'll have about a minute to come back.
So I'll go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
Do we have everybody back? I can't tell. Oh, everybody's back. Okay, sorry. I was wasting time. So I hope that exercise was useful for you. Sorry I didn't give you a whole ton of time or tell you what you were going to do in your discussion room. Does anybody want to either, I can see the chat now, throw in the chat what their 3 lenses are or unmute and share what their 3 lenses are? Their primary, we have many, but your primary 3 lenses.
I can share. One of the things we talked about in my group was like growing up, I was very fortunate to be from a middle-class family as a white person in a predominantly white neighborhood. And I think that led to a lot of privilege. So like recognizing that I have a very privileged lens going into the world, and like recognizing that that makes me lose a lot of lenses that other people might have, like going through adversity, going through like facing these things on a daily basis. So not necessarily like that's like I view things through privilege, but like it's a lens I don't have, and like seeing where areas I can acquire lenses and how I can like broaden my view, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think acknowledging privilege is also another skill that we all have to evaluate when we're doing that self-reflection. I'm going to actually add that to my next presentation, because I do think even as a person who comes from an underrepresented group, I do, because I have an education, because I have certain access to certain things, living in an urban community, like I have to acknowledge that privilege too. So thanks, Erin. Thank you. Anybody else? I do know that wasn't a whole lot of time to spend with your group. Half of that time you probably are introducing yourself. So I'm sorry I didn't give you enough time. I do definitely want you to think about what those lenses are and how they shape your perspective as you think that as the more you think about your own developing your own cultural humility. So thanks for participating in that. So the last slide I have, what did I do? Okay, the last slide I have for you, I'm gonna talk about very quickly because we are running out of time. And so thinking about, like I said before, thinking about cultural humility and thinking about anti-racism, they do go hand in hand. Anti-racism requires the ability to examine your own biases and engage in critical thinking. So really learning about racism, learning about the intersectionality of race, and all of the different lenses that people bring, the different experiences people bring. In this case with AHEC, like the rurality component of race and rurality is so important to really be thinking about. The other part is to listen, and I talked a lot about that in the patient care example I gave about when somebody's willing to give you that information, to really take that opportunity to listen. Participating in different activities, whether that's attending webinars on different gathering different cultural experiences or information, but that's also about taking part in events that are designed to combat racial injustices. And so that's your, if you're all on college campuses, that's your guest speakers who are coming in to talk about their research in an underrepresented community, to talk about the effects of boarding school and historical trauma, all of the different things. Sorry, I'm using examples that come up most frequently from my perspective, but there's all of these learning opportunities, and really attending and participating, asking questions, thinking critically about the information that they're sharing with you is really important. And then discussing racism, not only with your colleagues, but with your friends. I know that doesn't sound like the funnest thing to talk about, but the more we talk about how race and racism affect our structures, our professions, the access to quality healthcare, the easier it will be to start thinking about ways to create equitable practices. And so really talking about what that means, not in a confrontational way, and it more in a, being curious and wanting to educate not only yourself, but your peers as well. And then really seeking diversity. These recommendations all come from Ibram X. Kendi, who is one of the leading scholars in the teaching about the concept of anti-racism, but really about racial discrimination. And so if you Google him, he has some resources out there to really, if you want to start working on anti-racism. With that being said, we're right at 5 o'clock. I have a video that's 3 minutes long that you can stick around for. You can also throw some questions in the chat. I'll stay for a few minutes and try to answer some of those things, but I really did want to end our session. Well, we were going to end with anti-racism, but we don't have time. So I'm going to end with this video, 6 misconceptions about Native American people. And like I said, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat.
Hi, my name is Donette Rayom. I'm a Native American girl, and today you're about to get schooled.
we've evolved and, you know, not all of us lived in teepees.
Teepees were made for only travel uses.
Well, we own one, but we don't live in it.
We don't live in it.
We just camp in it whenever we want to.
We use them for things like ceremonies or camping and such, but we don't live in them. I have to say to that, where is my check? We really don't get anything for free. Everything we get, we have to work for it just like everybody else. If we had free healthcare, then the diabetes and heart disease rate would be very, very low. But at this point in time, it's very high.
Our dad works to provide for us. We don't get like money or anything.
We get schooling for free. That's not true either. We have to meet the same academic requirements as any other ethnicity.
You still have to apply for scholarships.
I thought it was just Donald Trump that didn't pay taxes. If we were rich off of casinos, why would we need government money?
I think we just mostly lose our money to casinos. We all gamble.
Not all Native Americans wear headdresses. In some tribes, they don't wear them at all.
In my tribe, we don't wear headdresses, and we never did. Women don't wear headdresses, and you have to earn them.
It wasn't just given to them or handed down to them. You have to earn every feather that makes up that headdress. If you were to buy a headdress, that would be disrespectful because there's no meaning behind it. You didn't do anything to earn it. All you did was pay for it. That's racist. And a lot of people say that the redskin term comes from the color of our skin, but if you look at me, I'm not red.
Society is just played into it like the word redskins is okay when it's not.
The word redskin came about from the scalping of Native Americans. Redskin means the blood that was dripped from down on their faces. That's a major league sports team, and their argument against changing the name would be just like me having a conversation with my mom, and my mom asked me, "Why don't you like Brussels sprouts?" Because I don't.
Not like we have a mascot that's called White Man.
In a way that's making fun of our culture and who we are. And we're human beings just like everybody else.
All right. I wanted to end with a little bit of humor, and gosh, what cuter way than with some Native girls dropping some truth. So I hope you all enjoyed that video. It's on YouTube. Another way to get education. So thank you all for participating. Sorry I didn't have enough time for questions, but I really appreciate everybody who attended.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. For Montana AHEC scholars, your attendance on this event will be updated within the week, so give us some time. And yes, all the thanks to Dr. Hill and sharing your knowledge. I learned a lot, and I'm sure the students did as well.
Thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. This was a great turnout, and I can we had like way more engagement than we usually do with the students. So yeah, I really appreciate it and excited we were able to offer it to the students.
Awesome. Good.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm glad we had good participation. I hope it was good content and useful.
Yes.